There are moments when heaven does not whisper, but shatters the silence. And for a man who had already lost everything sacred, that kind of encounter feels less like hope and more like ruin. Ezekiel had spent his life preparing to stand in the presence of God, to serve within walls of stone and ritual, to become a priest among priests. Yet now he stood in dust and exile, far from the temple he would never enter, convinced that whatever glory once filled Israel had been left behind with its broken gates. And then, without warning, the sky tore open, not above Jerusalem, but above Babylon. And what descended was not comfort, but something far more terrifying. A storm alive with fire, creatures that moved with impossible precision, wheels that turned without losing direction, and a throne that hovered where no throne should be. Everything Ezekiel thought he understood about God unraveled in a single overwhelming vision, because this was not the quiet presence of ritual, but raw, uncontained glory. Yet the deepest shock was not what he saw, but where he saw it, because if God could appear here, in exile, in chaos, in a land that was not holy, then nothing Ezekiel believed about distance, loss, or abandonment could remain intact, and the life he thought was over was in truth just beginning. By the waters of the Kebar River, where the current moved slowly, as if burdened by the grief of a people, Ezekiel lived among the displaced, men and women who once sang in Jerusalem but now spoke in hushed tones about what had been lost, as though even memory itself might fade if handled too roughly. Babylon rose around them in towering walls and ordered streets, a kingdom of power and certainty that left no room for the fragile identity of exiles, and every passing day seemed to confirm the same quiet verdict. Their God had remained behind, confined to a temple now distant and unreachable. Ezekiel carried that weight more deeply than most, because he had not only lost a homeland, but a calling that had defined his entire life, having been trained from youth to serve in sacred courts that no longer existed for him, leaving his purpose suspended somewhere between past expectation and present silence. The elders debated what this meant, whether their suffering was punishment or abandonment, while younger voices began to question if the God of Israel had ever truly held power at all, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, faith eroded into something thinner, more uncertain. In this world where Babylon's God seemed victorious and Israel's God seemed distant, Ezekiel remained an unlikely figure, not a leader, not a warrior, but a quiet man shaped for a role that history had taken from him, standing at the edge of a story he did not yet realize he was about to carry. It began as a disturbance at the edge of the horizon, a gathering of clouds that did not move like ordinary weather, but seemed to pulse with intention, as though the sky itself had awakened and was advancing toward him. The wind rose without warning, carrying heat instead of relief, and within it flashed streaks of lightning that did not fade, but lingered, illuminating something deeper within the storm that no natural eye was meant to see. Ezekiel stood frozen as the vision unfolded, because from within the fire emerged forms that defied understanding. 4 living creatures whose movements were perfectly synchronized, each bearing multiple faces that looked in every direction at once, their wings outstretched and sounding like rushing waters, like armies in motion, like creation itself responding to a command. Beside them, wheels appeared, vast and intricate, intersecting within one another and covered in eyes, turning without shifting direction, as if guided by a will beyond anything human. Then, above it all, something even more impossible took shape. A throne suspended over the living beings, and upon it a figure radiant with brilliance, both human and unapproachable, surrounded by a glow like fire wrapped in light. The weight of it pressed into Ezekiel's soul until he could no longer stand, and he collapsed to the ground, overwhelmed not only by what he saw, but by the undeniable truth that this encounter was meant for him. The voice that followed did not soothe the terror of the vision, but sharpened it into purpose, calling Ezekiel not to understanding, but to obedience, as he was commanded to stand and listen while the weight of divine intention settled upon him. This was no private revelation meant to comfort a weary soul, but a commission that would place him in direct conflict with his own people, because the message he was given was not one they longed to hear, but one they would resist with hardened hearts. He was told that Israel was rebellious, stubborn, and unwilling to listen, that their exile had not yet broken their pride, and that his role would not be to persuade them with gentle words, but to confront them with truth that cut deeper than their chains. Then came the command that defied all reason. A scroll was placed before him, filled not with hope, but with lament, mourning, and woe, and he was told to consume it, to take the message into himself until it became part of who he was. Though the scroll tasted sweet upon his tongue, its meaning settled within him like a burden he could not escape, because he now understood that the true danger was not Babylon's power, but Israel's blindness, and that if nothing changed, the consequences would reach far beyond exile into devastation that had not yet come. The calling did not leave him space to retreat into silence, because what had been revealed now carried a consequence that reached beyond his own life, pressing into the fate of an entire people, as the voice declared that he was to become a watchman, one who sees danger before it arrives and bears the responsibility to speak, whether he is heard or not. This was no longer about vision or wonder, but accountability, because if he failed to warn them, their destruction would not only be theirs to carry, but his as well, binding his obedience to their survival in a way that stripped away every excuse for hesitation. Ezekiel felt the weight of it settle into him, heavy and inescapable, as the memory of the throne above the living creatures burned into his mind, refusing to fade or soften, reminding him that what he had seen was not a passing moment, but an unchangeable reality. He could not return to the quiet anonymity of exile, could not pretend that he was still just a displaced priest waiting for restoration, because the encounter had redefined him entirely, leaving no version of his former life intact. And so, standing between fear and obedience, he made the choice that would sever him from everything familiar, declaring within himself that he would speak what he had been given, whether they listened or turned away, because silence was no longer an option and there was no path back. What had entered Ezekiel as a command now began to unfold as a pattern, because the scroll he had consumed, once strangely sweet, revealed its deeper weight as he spoke, each word carrying both warning and a strange, hidden hope, as though judgment itself was not the end, but a doorway no one wanted to walk through. The people heard him, yet did not truly listen, dismissing his actions as madness when he lay bound on his side for days, when he built miniature scenes of siege and destruction, when his life itself became the message, each act a living symbol of what was coming. And yet, beneath what seemed like chaos, something else was moving with precision, just as the wheels he had seen within the vision had turned without deviation, guided by a force beyond human control, because events began aligning in ways no one could explain, as whispers of unrest, distant conflict, and inevitable collapse echoed closer with each passing day. What once appeared random now carried direction, and what once seemed like silence from God now revealed itself as deliberate restraint. In this unfolding reversal, Ezekiel himself stood transformed, no longer the quiet man shaped by loss, but a voice that could not be ignored, even when rejected, because the same people who believed God had abandoned them were now confronted with the unsettling truth that he had been present all along, speaking, warning, and moving, whether they chose to see it or not. The news arrived not as a surprise, but as a confirmation that no one wanted to face, carried on the breath of survivors whose voices trembled with the weight of what they had seen. Jerusalem had fallen, its walls broken, its temple consumed by fire, its sacred heart reduced to ash beneath foreign hands. Every warning Ezekiel had spoken now stood undeniable, yet instead of clarity, the people were overtaken by something far heavier than disbelief. Because if the temple, the very dwelling place of God, could be destroyed, then what remained of their identity, their covenant, their hope? Silence spread through the camp like a shadow, deeper than grief and more suffocating than fear, as if the final thread connecting them to God had been severed, leaving them suspended in a void where even memory could not offer comfort. The confrontation was no longer between prophet and people, nor between Israel and Babylon, but between despair and the possibility that God was still present, even after everything had collapsed. Then Ezekiel spoke again, not with warnings, but with vision, describing a valley filled with dry bones, scattered, lifeless, beyond restoration, yet at the command of God, they began to move, to gather, to breathe, rising into life where there had been only death. And in that moment, the question was no longer whether destruction had come, but whether they could believe that something new could rise from what had been lost. Out of the silence that followed devastation, a different kind of message began to take shape, one that did not erase what had been lost, but redefined what could still be restored, as Ezekiel spoke of a future not built on returning to what once was, but on becoming something entirely new. The God who had revealed his glory in exile now revealed his intention to transform from within, promising not merely to gather a scattered people, but to give them a new heart, one no longer hardened by rebellion or fear, and a new spirit that would sustain them beyond circumstance. The weight of exile, once seen as an ending, slowly shifted into something else, as the people began to understand that their identity had never been anchored in a place, but in a relationship that could not be destroyed by fire or distance, because the same presence that appeared in the storm was still with them in their brokenness. Ezekiel, who had once stood uncertain and displaced, now stood as a witness to that truth, not because everything had been restored, but because the meaning of restoration itself had been transformed. And in that realization, hope returned, not as a fragile wish tied to circumstances, but as something deeper, rooted in the unchanging reality that God had never left them and was still moving their story forward.
We walk with purpose now.
The vision did not end with Ezekiel, because what he saw by the river in exile continues to echo far beyond that moment, reaching into every place where people feel displaced, uncertain, or forgotten, reminding us that the presence of God has never been confined to temples, systems, or expectations we try to build around him. The living creatures still move within the imagination of faith, symbols of a divine order that exists even when the world appears chaotic, and the wheels that turned without losing direction still whisper the same unsettling truth, that nothing unfolding in our lives is without purpose, even when we cannot see the pattern. For those who stand in their own version of exile, whether shaped by loss, doubt, or distance from what once felt certain, Ezekiel's story reframes the question from, "Where is God?" to, "What if he is already here, moving in ways we do not yet understand?" Because the throne he saw was never tied to geography, but to authority that remains unshaken across time. And perhaps the most enduring challenge is not whether God still speaks, but whether we are willing to listen when his voice disrupts our assumptions, calls us beyond comfort, and asks us to trust a vision that feels far larger than ourselves. Because even now, the unlikely are still being called, and glory still appears where no one expects it.